My family humiliated me for being a welder, but when I inherited 70 acres and $200K from the uncle only I took care of, my brother forged the will to steal from me. I reported him, and now he has a criminal record. And everyone hates me for destroying his life. I'm 24 years old. I work as a welder and also as a part-time hunting guide, and I need to tell this story because basically my family hates me now for something that wasn't even my fault. The thing is, I've always been the black sheep of the family, you know, the one who didn't fit in because everyone else is super successful with their professional careers and I decided to work with my hands. My father, Robert, is a lawyer, and pretty successful, honestly. My mother, Jennifer, was a registered nurse, but she's retired now. And my siblings, well, that's where it gets worse. Chad has a chain of gyms and is always bragging about how much money he makes. Dylan has a tech startup and acts like he's the next Mark Zuckerberg or something. And my sister Amanda married Steven, who's also a corporate lawyer, and they live in a giant house that she won't stop showing off on Instagram. And then there's me, Alex, the welder who smells like burnt metal and spends his weekends in the woods tracking deer. My whole life, they made me feel like I'd disappointed the family by not going to college, by not wanting to be a lawyer or doctor or whatever they consider a respectable career. Family dinners were awful, seriously, because they always ended up asking me when I was going to get a real job and when I'd tell them I liked welding and that it was good money and I also enjoyed being a hunting guide. They'd look at me like I'd said I was selling drugs or something. The only person in my entire extended family who understood me was my great-uncle George. George was amazing. I mean, the guy had been a lawyer like my dad, but at some point in his life he decided that wasn't for him and bought himself a cabin with like 70 acres of land in the middle of nowhere. It was his refuge, I guess, where he could be at peace and do what he wanted without anyone judging him. I loved going to visit him because he never made me feel bad about my choices. On the contrary, he always told me it was admirable, that I knew what I wanted, and didn't let myself be pressured by others' expectations. We'd spend hours talking about hunting, nature, life in general, and he taught me a ton about living more simply and connected with the natural world. The rest of my family basically ignored George. They saw him as the weird one in the family, the one who had wasted his potential by going to live in the woods. They only visited him on Christmas and Thanksgiving, and even then it was more out of obligation than genuine interest. I remember Amanda once said George's cabin smelled weird, and she didn't understand how he could live so far from civilization. And Dylan always made comments about how George could have been a partner at some important firm if he hadn't retired so early. Everything changed about 2 years ago when George was diagnosed with cancer. It was lung cancer, advanced stage, and the doctors gave him maybe a year and a half if he was lucky. When the news reached the family, there was like this initial moment of shock and superficial sadness. You know, everyone said, "Oh no, how terrible," and sent their thoughts and prayers by text message, but nobody, literally nobody except me, offered to help him or visit him regularly. My mom said it was too hard for her to see George like that. My dad was too busy with important cases. Chad said his gyms required his constant attention. Dylan was raising capital for his startup, and Amanda and Steven had I don't know what social event every weekend. I decided I wasn't going to let George go through this alone. I started visiting him 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more if I could. I adjusted my work schedules, took fewer hunting guide jobs on weekends, and basically became his primary caregiver. I took him to his medical appointments, did his grocery shopping, cooked with him. We did maintenance on the cabin together when he still had the energy to do it. His dog, Maisie, an old golden retriever, became my companion too during those visits. At first, George tried to act like everything was fine, like the cancer was no big deal. But I could see how he was getting weaker little by little. He lost weight. It was harder for him to breathe. Some days he could barely get out of bed. Those days I'd stay with him. We'd sit on the cabin porch if the weather was nice, or inside by the fireplace if it was cold, and we'd just talk or sometimes stay in comfortable silence. He'd tell me stories from when he was young, about his years as a lawyer, about why he decided to leave all that behind. He told me he'd spent so much time chasing success and others' approval that he forgot to live for himself and that he didn't want me to make the same mistake. About 6 months into his diagnosis, George told me he'd updated his will. I didn't give it much thought at the time. Honestly, I wasn't thinking about inheritances or anything like that. I just wanted him to be comfortable and to know that someone loved Tim and cared about him. But he insisted on telling me that he'd decided to leave me the cabin and the 70 acres of land, plus like $200,000 specifically designated for renovations and property maintenance. I was shocked. Seriously, I didn't know what to say. I asked him if he was sure, if he wouldn't prefer to leave it to my dad or divide it among everyone, but George was very clear. He said I was the only one who had really taken care of him, the only one who understood the value of that place, and that he knew I would appreciate it and care for it like he had. This is where things start to get weird. About 2 months after that conversation, when George was already quite sick and it was obvious he didn't have much time left, suddenly my family started showing interest. Chad called me one day, asking how Uncle George was doing and if the cabin needed any repairs, that he could help financially if necessary. Dylan sent a message saying he'd been thinking about George and maybe they should organize a family gathering at the cabin soon. Amanda posted something on Facebook about valuing family and time together, with an old photo of George from like 10 years ago. My mom organized a family dinner, supposedly to talk about George's care, but the conversation quickly veered toward his property. Amanda started saying it would be a shame if the cabin was left abandoned after George, and maybe the family should consider turning it into some kind of shared vacation home. Stephen said from a legal standpoint, it would make more sense to sell it and divide the money. Dylan suggested they could make it a luxury Airbnb, that, with the right renovations, they could easily get like $3,000 a night. I stayed quiet during that whole conversation because I thought it was disgusting that they were talking about this while George was still alive. My dad noticed I wasn't participating and asked me what I thought, and honestly I told them I thought it was in poor taste to be planning what to do with George's things when he was still here. Chad laughed and said something like, well, someone has to think about these things practically, and that I probably didn't understand the financial implications because, well, I'm just a welder. George passed away on a Tuesday morning, about 6 months after that horrible dinner. I was with him, same as Maisie. It was quiet. I mean, as quiet as something like that can be. He simply stopped breathing while he slept. I called my dad to let him know, and he took care of contacting the rest of the family and making the funeral arrangements. The funeral was weird because my whole family acted like they'd been super close to George, crying and telling stories they probably didn't even remember correctly. Amanda gave a speech about how much she loved her great uncle and how much she was going to miss their deep conversations, when literally I can't remember her going to visit him even. Once during his illness, the will reading was scheduled for a week after the funeral. George's lawyer, Mr. Mitchell, called us all to his office. My whole family was there, everyone dressed formally, and there was a weird energy in the air, like anticipation. Mr. Mitchell started reading the will, and when he got to the property part, there was a moment of absolute silence. George had left the cabin, the 70 acres, and the $200,000 for renovations to me, Alex, his great-nephew. The rest of his estate, which wasn't small because he'd been a successful lawyer and had invested well, he left to various wildlife conservation organizations and a local animal shelter. I didn't know where to put myself. Everyone was staring at me, and I could see the confusion and anger forming on their faces. Amanda was the first to speak. Her voice came out like a screech when she asked if this was some kind of joke. Dylan said clearly, George wasn't in his right mind when he made this will. That probably the cancer had affected his judgment. My mom looked like she was going to cry. Not from sadness, but from indignation. My dad, being a lawyer, asked Mr. Mitchell if the will could be contested, and Mr. Mitchell very calmly explained that George had been very clear in his intentions, that he'd updated the will when he was still completely lucid, and that he'd included a specific clause saying that if anyone tried to contest the will, they would lose any consideration they might have had. Chad stood up and started yelling at me, telling me that obviously I'd manipulated George, that I'd taken advantage of a sick and vulnerable man. Stephen, Amanda's husband, started talking about undue influence and possible legal action. Dylan said this was basically theft, that I had no right to all that land and money when there were other family members who could make much better use of the resources. Amanda was crying, saying this wasn't fair, that George should have thought about The whole family, not just me. I tried to explain that I'd never asked George for anything, that I didn't even know I was going to inherit until he told me months before, but nobody was listening to me. My mom asked me how I could be so selfish that the least I could do was share the inheritance with my siblings. My dad said he expected more from me, that this showed a lack of character that frankly disappointed him. The meeting ended with half the family yelling at me and the other half completely ignoring me, and I left there feeling like garbage even though technically I hadn't done anything wrong. The following days were a nightmare. I received constant messages and calls from different family members. Some tried the emotional approach, saying how much it would mean to them to have access to the cabin, that it was part of the family history and should be shared. Others were more direct and hostile, accusing me of being a manipulator and a thief. Dylan sent me a message saying he'd calculated that if we sold the property and divided it equitably among the 4 siblings plus our parents, each one would receive like $300,000, and that my refusal to do this was proof of my greedy nature. About 2 weeks after the funeral, I went to the cabin to start cleaning and organizing George's things. I decided to keep Maisie because she already knew me well, and I didn't want her to end up in a shelter. But when I arrived, I realized someone had tried to get in. The door wasn't forced because it had good locks that George had installed, but there were obvious signs that someone had tried to open the windows. I installed security cameras that same day, cameras with motion detection that sent alerts to my phone. 3 days later, the cameras captured my mom, Amanda, and Stephen trying to enter the property. They had keys, probably old copies that George had given them years ago for emergencies, but I'd changed all the locks. I saw them in the video, trying different keys, looking through the windows, walking around the cabin like they were evaluating it. I saved the video and called my dad. I told him I'd seen Mom and Amanda trying to enter without my permission, and that if it happened again, I was going to have to report it as trespassing. He got angry with me, said I was being ridiculous, that it was his family, and they just wanted to see the place one last time to say goodbye to George. Amanda called me that night. Her voice was sweet and conciliatory, very different from how she'd been after the will reading. She told me she understood that George had given the property to me, but maybe we could reach an agreement. She and Stephen were willing to buy the cabin and land from me for $100,000, which according to her was a fair price considering the place needed a lot of renovations. I told her I wasn't interested in selling, and besides, $100,000 was ridiculous considering the land alone was easily worth $500,000 or more, according to the appraisals I'd seen. She got angry then and told me I was being unreasonable, that George would have wanted the family to stay together, not for me to exclude them all. The situation escalated horribly when Dylan presented what he said was a different version of George's will. According to this document, George had supposedly left instructions that the property be divided equitably among his great nieces and nephews, meaning the 4 of us. Mr. Mitchell contacted me immediately when he received this document and told me it was obviously fake, that the signature didn't match, that the format was incorrect, and that besides there were obvious inconsistencies in the legal language used. But Dylan insisted this was the true will, that he'd found it among some old papers of George's. I couldn't believe my brother had gone that far. I talked to Mr. Mitchell about what to do, and he recommended I report the document as fraud to the appropriate authorities. I did, and I also hired my own lawyer because this had already gotten completely out of control. The investigation didn't take long because, as Mr. Mitchell said, the forgery was pretty obvious. Dylan had basically downloaded a will template from the internet, had badly copied some paragraphs from the real will, and had tried to forge George's signature using a photo from some old document. When the authorities confronted Dylan, at first he denied everything, but the evidence was too clear. Eventually he admitted he'd created the document because he considered it unfair, that I kept everything. He ended up accepting a plea deal with the prosecution, where he pleaded guilty to attempted fraud and document forgery. He got community service, a considerable fine, and a probation period. He didn't go to prison because it was his first offense and because he eventually admitted what he'd done, but the fact that he now has a criminal record basically ruined many of his business opportunities. His startup's investors withdrew when they found out, and the company eventually fell apart. You'd expect this would be enough for my family to stop harassing me, but no. Now they blamed me for what had happened to Dylan. My mom called me crying, saying I'd destroyed my brother's life by being greedy and selfish, that I should have simply shared the property from the beginning and none of this would have happened. My dad sent me a formal email saying he was disappointed that I hadn't handled this in a more family-oriented way, that pressing charges against Dylan had been excessive and unnecessary. Chad said I was a traitor and had chosen money over family. It was Amanda who finally made me make the decision to cut contact completely. She sent me a long message, several paragraphs, where she basically said I was a horrible person who had taken advantage of George on his deathbed, that I'd manipulated a vulnerable elderly man to steal what should legitimately belong to the whole family, and that she hoped I could live with my conscience, knowing I'd destroyed our family out of greed. She ended the message saying that she and the rest of the family would never forgive me, and that basically, I was dead to them. I read that message like 3 times, and each time I got angrier because nothing she said was true. I didn't manipulate George. I was just there for him when nobody else was. I didn't steal anything. George made his own decisions about his property. And as for destroying the family, well, they did an excellent job of that themselves with their greed and false accusations. I sent them one last message, in a family group we still had at that time. I told them I was sorry things had ended this way, but that I wasn't going to apologize for respecting George's last wishes. I told them that if they ever wanted to have a relationship with me again, it would have to be on terms where they respected me and accepted my decisions. But until then, I didn't want to hear from them. After sending that message, I blocked them all. I blocked their numbers, their social media, everything. It was liberating in a way, but also incredibly sad. I basically lost my entire family at once, but at the same time, I realized that maybe I never really had their love or respect to begin with. I'd always been the least favorite, the one who didn't fit in, and now they just had one more reason to treat me like I was worthless. I moved into George's cabin permanently about 6 months ago. I used part of the money he left me to make necessary renovations, fixed the roof that had some leaks, updated the electrical system, improved the insulation for winters. The rest of the money I saved for future maintenance and additional improvements. I still work as a welder, but now I take jobs more selectively because I want to spend time enjoying this place that George entrusted to me. Maisie is happy here. She runs through the acres of land chasing squirrels and birds, sleeps in front of the fireplace at night. I sit on the same porch where George and I spent hours talking, and sometimes I can almost hear his voice telling me I did the right thing, not to let anyone make me feel guilty for living my life on my own terms. I've thought a lot about everything that happened, and although part of me is sad about having lost contact with my family, another part is at peace because I know I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. 2 weeks ago, I received a letter from my dad. He managed to find my new address somehow. I haven't opened it yet. It's there on the kitchen table, and every day I see it and wonder if I should read it or just throw it away. I don't know what he expects it to say that could change anything. Maybe someday I'll have the emotional energy to open it, but for now I'm focused on maintaining this beautiful place and honoring George's memory by living here the way he would have wanted. The irony of all this is that if my family had simply been there for George when he was sick, if they'd shown even a fraction of the care I gave him, maybe things would have been different. But they only got interested when they saw monetary value in his property, not when he needed companionship and support. George saw that clearly, and that's why he made the decisions he made. I was just fortunate enough to be the person who was actually there when it mattered, and now I'm living with the consequences of that. And honestly, looking at these 70 acres of forest with Maisie sleeping at my feet, I think the good consequences far outweigh the bad.